Lost Cut CatDog episode. The episode begins without the usual theme song. Instead, there is a single title card, Alone Together, written in jagged, almost hand-scrawled lettering, accompanied by a low, droning hum. The screen fades into CatDog's house, but something is off. The colors are dimmer, as if everything is seen through a veil of dust. The sky outside is a sickly green, devoid of clouds. Cat and dog are engaged in one of their usual arguments, their bickering voices sounding quieter than usual, as if muffled through layers of fabric. "Why must you always be so careless?" Cat snaps. His voice has an uncharacteristic strain, almost trembling. Dog, unusually subdued, doesn't respond with his typical excitable energy. Instead, he mutters something under his breath, staring out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you even listening to me?" Cat shouts, but Dog doesn't react. Instead, he abruptly leaps off the couch and bolts outside, his movements stiff and jerky. Confused, Cat is dragged along, yelling in protest as Dog begins furiously digging into the ground near a large tree in their yard. "What are you doing?" Cat demands, clawing at the dirt to try and pull Dog back. Dog ignores him, his digging becoming more frantic. His paws move unnaturally fast, the sound of claws against earth growing louder, almost deafening. Finally, Dog stops. "It's down here," he whispers, his voice hollow and distant. "It's always been down here." The camera slowly pans down to reveal a decayed, blackened bone in the hole Dog has dug. But rather than being excited, Dog stares at it with an expression of abject horror. His ears flatten, and he lets out a low, guttural whine. Cat, growing nervous, tries to pull them away, but the ground beneath them suddenly gives way, and they fall into darkness. When they land, the environment has changed entirely. They are now in a series of tunnels, the walls pulsating with a warped, fleshy texture that glistens in the dim light. The air is filled with faint, distorted laughter, though no source can be seen. "What is this place?" Cat cries, his voice echoing unnaturally. Dog doesn't respond. He starts walking forward, dragging Cat with him. The animation becomes increasingly erratic, with the camera angles tilting unnervingly and the colors shifting between sickly hues. The further they go, the more surreal the environment becomes. Strange shapes move within the fleshy walls, their outlines vaguely resembling grotesque faces. Whispers join the laughter, speaking incomprehensible words that seem to grow louder the more Cat protests. "Dog, stop. We need to go back," Cat pleads, his voice cracking with desperation. Dog finally stops, turning his head slowly to look at Cat. His eyes are now pure black voids, leaking inky streams that drip onto the ground. "No going back," Dog says in a voice that is not his own, layered and deep, as if multiple people are speaking in unison. Cat screams and begins clawing at the ground, trying to anchor them in place, but the tunnel floor beneath them seems to ripple and pull them forward like a conveyor belt. The laughter grows louder, almost deafening, as they are dragged deeper into the labyrinth. At last, they reach a large, cavernous room. In the center stands a massive mirror, its frame made of intertwined bones. The surface of the mirror is covered in a dark, viscous liquid, but as CatDog approaches, the liquid begins to recede, revealing their reflection, or rather, Cat's reflection. The mirror shows only Cat. Dog's side is empty. Cat stares, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks, as his reflection slowly begins to change. The mirrored Cat smiles, but it's an unnatural, too-wide grin that stretches far beyond the bounds of his face. The reflection raises a hand and waves. Behind them, Dog begins to laugh, a deep, unnatural laugh that doesn't belong to him. "Dog?" Cat cries, turning to look, but Dog is no longer attached. Cat is alone. The screen flickers and distorts as the laughter crescendos. The last image is Cat's reflection in the mirror, his face frozen in a silent scream, while the sound of static and distorted laughter drowns everything else. The screen cuts to black, lingering for an uncomfortably long time before the credits roll silently, written in the same jagged script as the title card. Violence and silence. In the year 1810, under the pallid eye of a moon that hung like an omen, a child was born, her cries piercing the heavy stillness of the night. The land seemed to hold its breath, the distant murmur of drumbeats merging with the rustle of wind over the plains. She came into this world amid ritual and reverence, the weight of ancestral hopes pressed onto her fragile form. Elders encircled her, their voices weaving songs older than memory, their breath heavy with the smoke of sacred fires. They named her Ayana, the eternal blossom, a fragile symbol of resilience against the encroaching tide of change. Her father, a man forged in conflict, ruled with a fierce and unrelenting hand. He was a sentinel against the slow march of annihilation, his days consumed by the clash of iron and blood. The settlers came like locusts devouring the land, and his heart burned with the knowledge that every inch ceded was a betrayal of those who had walked before him. His death was sudden, a swift unraveling of the fragile order he had maintained. Leadership passed to his brother, a man more scholar than warrior, though the shadows of war lingered still, dark as storm clouds over the plains. Life in the village was a quiet defiance, a fragile dance of survival under the weight of inevitable extinction. The warriors sharpened their spears against the stone, their faces etched with patterns that spoke of lineage and loss. The elders, their voices cracked like weathered bark, whispered tales into the fire, imploring the spirits to shield them from the world's cruelty. The children's laughter, fleeting as smoke, rang out along the riverbank, yet even they seemed to understand that joy was an act of rebellion in a world poised to crush it. Ayana, just 12 summers old, was marked by a restless spirit. She wandered the ancient forest that loomed beyond the village like a sentinel of old gods, her bare feet silent against the moss and pine. Among the trees she found fleeting moments of peace. Here the air felt alive with secrets. The rustle of leaves spoke of things older than time, the low call of distant birds echoed like forgotten hymns. But the forest was no sanctuary that day. A sound, a deliberate crack of a branch, stilled her breath. She crouched low, her fingers gripping the earth as two figures emerged from the thicket. The first was a boy, close to her age, his dark skin luminous in the fractured light. There was something otherworldly about him, an ease that belied his youth, his fine clothes a stark contrast to the feral setting. The second figure was a different creature altogether. His bald head shone with an unnatural pallor, and his black coat swallowed the light around him. He moved with a predator's grace, his wide grin a mockery of warmth. When he laughed, the sound felt like the grinding of bones beneath a millstone. Ayana froze, her instincts screaming louder than the silent forest. Her people spoke of him, the judge. A man untethered to morality, a being who wove chaos into the threads of the world. He was no mere man but a specter that loomed over the edge of understanding, his presence an affront to the natural order. The judge's pale eyes scanned the forest with surgical precision, and for a moment, they seemed to pierce the veil of her hiding place. Ayana's heart thundered as she fled, the forest closing in around her as her bare feet tore through the underbrush. She did not stop until her village appeared before her, its walls a thin line of defense against the horror she had glimpsed. Her cries of alarm shattered the village's fragile rhythm. "The judge," she shouted, her voice raw. "I saw the judge." The elders murmured among themselves, their faces creased with unease. Her uncle, the chief, stepped forward, his countenance darkened by her words. He pressed her for details, his voice steady despite the weight of her revelation. Ayana recounted the encounter, her voice trembling but sure. When she spoke of the boy who stood beside the judge, her words hung in the air like a blade poised to drop. Before the chief could respond, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was the boy, his movements unhurried as he carried a bundle that shimmered in the dying light. Gold, silver, jewels, tokens of a world far removed from theirs. He laid them down gently and raised his head, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Greetings," he said, his tone measured and eerily calm. "I bring you gifts." The chief regarded him with suspicion, his eyes narrowing. "And what is the price of these gifts?" The boy's smile was thin, almost mocking. "Only your trust," he said. The words hung heavy in the air, and the villagers murmured among themselves. Ayana, her gaze locked on the boy, felt a knot tighten in her chest. She stepped closer, her voice rising above the din. "Who are you?" she demanded. The boy turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I am called the Commander," he said, his voice carrying the weight of worlds she could not fathom. The fire crackled low as the chief studied the man before him, his face carved with shadows by the flickering light. "Why have you come here?" he asked, his voice flat and unyielding. The man stood motionless, his broad frame silhouetted against the gloom of the desert night. "I seek refuge," he said, his voice as calm as the night air. "As you can see, I am no white man, nor a Mexican, nor one of your own people. I look like I should be enslaved alongside the others who share my skin, but I am not. And they hate that. They hate it so much that they send bounty hunters, bloodhounds, whole armies of men who would string me up for the crime of being free. They want me dead. They want me to hang from some high rock, my neck snapped in two so the world might forget I ever lived." The chief leaned forward, his face impassive. "And so you come to us? Seeking refuge?" Yes, the man said simply. That is all. The chief's dark eyes lingered on him, weighing his words, his posture, the quiet defiance in his tone. You carry trouble with you, stranger. Trouble finds men like you, and it will find you here. The man shrugged, his expression unchanging. Trouble finds men everywhere. The question is not whether it will come but whether you will face it standing or on your knees. The chief's lips tightened, but he said nothing. He turned to one of his guards, who stood nearby with a long spear, the point glinting faintly in the firelight. Fetch the elders, he said. The guard nodded and disappeared into the night. The chief rose slowly, his knees creaking with the weight of years, and gestured to the man. Wait here. We will decide your fate. The man nodded and stepped back, his eyes following the chief as he moved toward the heart of the village. He found a low, flat rock just outside the circle of firelight and sat down, his head bowed as if in thought, though his ears remained sharp, tuned to the murmurs rising from the village center. Inside the circle of fires, the argument had already begun. Why should we trust him? A woman's voice hissed. He's an outsider and he's brought death to our doorstep. His kind are cursed, another said. They bring blood wherever they go. And yet he stands, a third voice broke in, a man's older and steadier. The ones who chase him have not caught him. There's a strength in that. But what of the judge? Another voice said, sharper, more urgent. Ayana saw him with the judge. That is not a thing to take lightly. The judge walks with death itself. The voices rose, some in anger, others in caution, until the chief raised his hand. Enough, he said. His voice cut through the din like a blade. We will let him stay. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathering, some shocked, others resigned. But only for 3 days, the chief continued. 3 days to test his character. If he proves himself worthy, he may stay. If not, he will leave or we will make him leave. The elders nodded, though some reluctantly, and the decision was made. Outside the circle of firelight, the man sat motionless, the faint sound of his breathing the only sign of life. He watched the village from his perch, his thoughts inscrutable, his shadow long and solitary in the flickering light. When the chief returned, he stood before the man and spoke without preamble. You may stay for 3 days. Nothing more. The man met his gaze and inclined his head. 3 days is all I need. The chief frowned, something unreadable passing across his face, but he turned without another word and disappeared back into the shadows. The man leaned back against the rock, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 3 days, he murmured to himself. Time enough for the world to shift. That same night, as the boy sat alone near a fire, Ayana approached cautiously, but curiously, smoke curled from his hand, a strange scent that stung her nose. What is that? She asked, her voice cautious. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unfathomable. A door, he said simply. To speak with the gods. Ayana stared at the smoldering roll, her unease growing. And what do they say? The boy chuckled, a low, humorless sound. They listen. But they don't speak to me anymore. The fire crackled between them, its light casting shadows that danced like spirits on the edge of the world. Ayana watched the boy, her heart heavy with questions she dared not ask. The smoke rose and twisted into the dark sky, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if the gods were watching. If they were, they gave no sign. The commander had quickly ingratiated himself within the tribe, a feat both remarkable and unnerving. In just 2 weeks, he transformed from an outsider under suspicion to a figure of respect and admiration. His charisma was a weapon, sharp and deliberate, and he wielded it masterfully. He joined the warriors during their hunts, his skill with a bow and his uncanny ability to track prey impressing even the most seasoned hunters. He shared stories of far-off lands, weaving tales so vivid that the elders themselves leaned in closer to listen. He brought trinkets of gold, finely crafted knives, and foreign silks, offering them as gifts to the tribe. And yet, not everyone was captivated by his charm. Ayana remained wary, her instincts gnawing at her like an unhealed wound. Something about the commander's easy smile unsettled her, the way it didn't quite reach his dark eyes. Her unease was shared by Chaitan, a boy of 13 whose spirit was as gentle as his heart was strong. Chaitan wanted to become a warrior, but not out of love for battle or glory. He dreamed of peace, a fragile but beautiful vision he clung to in a world marred by violence. People can live in harmony, he often said, his soft voice carrying a quiet conviction. If they only try. The commander despised this mindset. To him, Chaitan's ideals were not just naive but an insult to his very existence, his own spirit. The world, as the commander saw it, was forged by power and shaped by force. Kindness, he believed, was a weakness that invited destruction. And because Chaitin refused to see what the commander saw because he wouldn't see his worldview, he became a target to the commander, a target of quiet malice. The village existed on the knife's edge of tension. Nestled deep within the vast forests, it was a place of breathtaking beauty and haunting shadows. The towering pines stood like sentinels, their dark trunks blotting out the sun, while the air carried the mingled scents of earth, smoke, and the faint tang of blood from freshly hunted game. By day, the villagers went about their routines, women grinding corn into flour, warriors sharpening their weapons, children weaving reeds into simple toys. But by night the village transformed. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows across the lodges, and the wind carried whispers of unease. It was during these nights that people began to disappear. First, it was a hunter, a man known for his strength and pride, who had openly questioned the commander's intentions. Then it was a young woman who had once turned her back on him during a gathering. One by one, those who resisted the commander's growing influence vanished without a trace. Not even a corpse to be found. Ayana and Chaitin noticed the pattern before anyone else did. They would whisper to each other under the cover of darkness, their voices trembling with the weight of their suspicions. "It's him," Chaitin said one night, his wide eyes reflecting the dim light of the stars. "It has to be." Ayana nodded, her jaw tightening. "But how? No one hears anything. No one sees anything." "Maybe they don't want to see," Chaitin replied bitterly. For months after the last disappearance, the village settled into an eerie calm. The air grew thick with unspoken fears, but no one dared voice them. It was as though the missing had been swallowed by the forest itself, and the villagers carried on, their unease buried beneath forced smiles. The commander, however, seemed to thrive in the silence. He became even more ingratiating, his charm bordering on suffocating. He began to focus much of his attention on Ayana, bringing her small gifts, a carved bone pendant, a woven bracelet of bright colors, an unfamiliar flower he claimed grew in distant lands. He told her stories of cities where the buildings touched the sky and ships that sailed across endless oceans. At first, Ayana resisted. But the commander's persistence wore on her, and soon, her guarded demeanor softened, not out of trust but out of exhaustion. Chaitin noticed. Every time he saw Ayana speaking with the commander, laughing at one of his stories, or accepting one of his gifts, it felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. The commander knew, and he exploited it. Whenever Chaitin was near, the commander would drape an arm casually over Ayana's shoulder, his smile smug and knowing. He would offer Chaitin a pointed glance, the kind that said, "You can't win." Chaitin began to change. His once gentle demeanor grew more subdued. He avoided gatherings, spending his days wandering the forest, seeking solace among the trees that had always been his refuge. But even there he couldn't escape the weight of the commander's presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the forest in hues of gold and shadow, Chaitin sat by the river's edge, skipping stones across the surface. Ayana found him there, her steps hesitant. "Chaitin," she said softly, sitting beside him. He didn't look at her. "What do you want, Ayana?" She flinched at the coldness in his tone. "You've been avoiding me?" He sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "It's him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know it is. The commander, he's dangerous." Ayana hesitated, her fingers curling around the bone pendant the commander had given her. "He hasn't done anything to harm me," she said, but her words rang hollow even to her own ears. Chaitin's jaw tightened. "Not yet," he said darkly. "But he's tearing us apart. And you're letting him." Ayana stared at him, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She didn't trust the commander, but she couldn't ignore the pull of his stories, his gifts, his charm. And yet, as she looked at Chaitin, she realized how much she missed the boy he used to be, the boy who believed in peace. Unbeknownst to them, the commander watched from the shadows, his dark eyes glinting with satisfaction. For him, this was the game, to unravel Chaitin, thread by thread, until there was nothing left of the boy but anger and despair. The village continued its uneasy existence, the tension between its inhabitants growing like an unspoken storm. And in the center of it all, the commander smiled, biding his time, his true intentions hidden behind a mask of benevolence. One of the warriors saw them first, a party of Americans cresting the ridgeline at dusk. They were little more than silhouettes against the bleeding sun, armed with muskets, pistols, and blades that caught the light like the eyes of carrion birds. They moved with purpose, their shadows long and jagged across the earth. The village decided to avoid them. It was not fear but prudence. The forest was vast, the paths myriad. They would vanish among the trees, a ghost people, their fires cold and trails covered. The warriors kept watch that night, their spears bristling like thorns in the dark. But the Americans came nonetheless. It was in the deep hours of the night when the stillness was broken. No one saw them approach, no alarms were raised. The village woke to whispers of movement, the faint echo of foreign voices on the wind. Fires burned low, casting shapes that writhed against the lodges like restless spirits. When dawn broke, the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. It was then they realized Chayton was gone. The boy had vanished without a trace, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. At first no one spoke of it. His disappearance was a wound too fresh, the silence of his absence too sharp. Days turned to weeks, the search futile and abandoned. Ayana walked the forest paths alone, her eyes scanning the underbrush, her heart a hollow thing that beat only to mourn. Then he was found. They came upon him by accident, miles from the village, where the trees thinned and the land gave way to barren, sun-blistered flats. His body lay twisted among the dry grass, exposed to the unrelenting sky. He was naked, his skin pale and bloated, pocked with wounds too numerous to count. The stench hit them first, a vile miasma of death that turned their stomachs and brought bile to their throats. It was the warriors who ventured closer, their faces grim and unreadable, their hands gripping spears that felt useless in the face of what lay before them. Chayton was unrecognizable. His body had been desecrated beyond the scope of human cruelty. Stab wounds marred his flesh, each one deliberate, each one a punctuation of malice. His back was a tapestry of broken bones, his spine shattered and bent into an unnatural arch. His feet bore marks of unspeakable agony, as if something had been driven through them again and again. His face, once soft with boyhood, was a mask of ruin. His jaw hung askew, his features sunken and distorted. Where there had once been light, there was now only the gaping maw of death. And there, clutched in his lifeless hand, was a coin. It was a simple thing, stamped from base metal, its edges dulled by time. But the mark upon it was unmistakable. An eagle, talons clutching arrows, the insignia of the Americans. The warriors carried his body back to the village. They moved in silence, their faces carved from stone, their eyes haunted by the image of the boy who had once played among their children, who had dreamed of peace. When they arrived, the women wept and tore at their hair, their wails rising like a dirge into the heavens. Ayana stood apart, her face pale and her hands trembling. She stared at the body, her mind struggling to reconcile the thing before her with the boy she had known. She wanted to cry, to scream, but the sound caught in her throat like a stone. The village gathered to mourn, their grief turning swiftly to rage. They spoke in hushed tones of revenge, of blood for blood. They sharpened their spears and strung their bows, preparing for the fight that would surely come. And the commander watched, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. In the days that followed, the village was a hive of activity. The warriors trained relentlessly, their muscles taut with fury, their minds filled with images of retribution. The women prepared provisions, their hands steady despite the trembling of their hearts. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was to come, their laughter subdued, their games forgotten. The commander moved among them like a shadow, offering words of encouragement, stoking the flames of their anger. His eyes burned with a dark joy, a terrible satisfaction that came not from justice but from chaos. For he knew what they did not. The Americans had not taken Chayton. But the truth did not matter. The coin was enough. The bodies that would fall, the blood that would spill, it was all inevitable now, a tide of violence that could not be turned. And in its wake, the commander would remain unscathed, unchallenged, his grip on the tribe tighter than ever. The forest, ancient and watchful, seemed to hold its breath. The trees whispered of doom, their branches swaying with the weight of unseen eyes. And in the heart of it all, Chayton's lifeless body lay buried, his dreams of peace as broken as the bones that had once carried him. The storm was coming. And the commander, ever the opportunist, stood ready to guide it.